The auction had ended. Only one remained unwanted, considered worthless by all but one man. They cremated the deceased at daybreak, ash mingling with the relentless sleet that painted the settlement's reinforced domes in dismal patterns. Nobody lingered to witness the disposal. On Taros 9, death wasn't sacred, merely an inconvenience requiring efficient elimination. One fewer oxygen consumer, one fewer resource drain. Kel Renner continued his trek, the biting wind clawing at his thermal coat like a desperate creature. Crystalline frost crunched beneath his boots, each step echoing against the perpetual twilight. Above, utility lights hummed on failing circuits, struggling against the eternal polar darkness that enveloped this forgotten outpost. The jagged silhouettes of abandoned mining equipment pierced the horizon, skeletal monuments to corporate ventures that had sucked the moon dry and left it to die. Each breath Kel took burned in his lungs, the atmosphere processors struggling to maintain breathable oxygen levels in the settlement's outer rings. The settlement was dying, held together by patch welds, jury-rigged power conduits, and inhabitants too desperate or guilty to seek passage elsewhere. Kel hadn't come for the auction, at least that's what he'd told himself 3 times before the processing hangar appeared in his field of vision. The ancient transport depot had been hastily converted into a market of misery, improvised enclosures, heat generators, and security drones whirring along corroded ceiling tracks. The bidding had finished hours earlier, leaving only emptiness and shadow. The lingering scent of fear mixed with industrial lubricants, creating an atmosphere as suffocating as the desperation that permeated the colony. Kel stepped through the entrance arch. Recycled air rushed to meet him, carrying undertones of industrial lubricant and unfiltered fear. All cages stood vacant, or so he initially thought. In the furthest corner, half concealed by frost and darkness, a figure remained motionless, abandoned after all others had been claimed. She sat completely still, knees drawn up, arms limp beside her, cascades of violet hair flowing down her back, iridescent strands that resembled liquid twilight frozen in mid-fall. In the dim light, her hair captured what little illumination existed, refracting it in prismatic patterns across the enclosure walls. Her skin wasn't human. Even from a distance, Kel noticed the subtle cerulean tint, too smooth and flawless. She showed no reaction to his approach, no acknowledgement of his presence. The cold had formed intricate frost patterns along her exposed arms, delicate crystalline structures that seemed to grow like living organisms across her skin. Kel paused, studying her with a frown. He wasn't a savior, hadn't been one for years, yet something in her posture, the stillness that transcended sleep, the silence deeper than resignation, kept him rooted. His chronometer pulsed against his wrist, a gentle reminder that the external temperature would drop another 15 degrees when Taros 9 rotated further away from its distant sun. Time was running out for her and for him. He crouched beside the enclosure. Frost had formed intricate patterns along its edges. "Did they forget about you?" he asked softly. No response. Up close, she appeared almost sculptural, as if carved from a single piece of azure ice left to gradually melt. Her face remained angled away, eyes closed. She might have been deceased if not for the faint condensation forming on the enclosure's inner wall near her lips. He noticed markings on her neck, not injuries but deliberate patterns, like ritual scarification, or perhaps biometric implants gone dormant. Alive. Barely. He reached through the bars, movements deliberate and unhurried. His fingertips brushed against hers, ice cold. No visible reaction, then a nearly imperceptible twitch. Her fingers flexed once, as if some part of her wished to retreat but lacked the necessary strength. The neural inhibitor collar around her throat pulsed once, emitting a faint blue glow before fading again to dormancy. Her silence wasn't emptiness. It carried weight, like meeting the gaze of a deity who had long since abandoned compassion. "She's not for sale anymore," a gruff voice announced from behind. Kel stood, turning toward 2 auction handlers. One wore a damaged respirator loosely around his neck. The other chewed on a synthetic stimulant stick with aggressive disinterest. Their uniforms bore the faded insignia of Helix Corporation's security division, corporate cast-offs now earning scraps by facilitating the trade of living merchandise. Was she part of the main offering? Kel asked, nodding toward the enclosure. Yeah, the first handler replied. Didn't move, didn't communicate. Waste of resources. No takers. His voice carried the practiced indifference of someone who had long since excised any capacity for empathy. What is she? Kel inquired. Etherian variant, the second man replied, spitting onto the floor. Nah, more likely some sanctuary hybrid from the Meridian Expanse. Thought herself too precious to speak. Might be neurologically impaired. Irrelevant now. He tapped a data screen showing a complex neural pattern. Resonance sensitivity off the charts, but completely internalized. Useless for extraction. The first handler shrugged. If you want her, take her, no cost required. Just sign the transfer and go. We plan to dispose of her in the waste processing unit anyway. His fingers brushed against the stunner at his hip, a habitual gesture that spoke of casual violence. Kel remained silent, looking back at her. Violet hair cascading over cerulean shoulders. Motionless, not even shivering, offering neither resistance nor hope. The light caught the curve of her cheekbone, revealing a faint pattern of luminescent markings beneath her skin. Dormant bioluminescence, another sign of her non-human origins. He approached the nearby terminal. The biometric scanner illuminated beneath his palm, reading not just his fingerprints, but the unique vascular pattern beneath his skin. The transfer file appeared with a single annotation. Unclaimed specimen deemed unsuitable for labor or companionship. He endorsed it regardless. The scanner pulsed green, logged his biometric signature, and transmitted the data to the colony's central registry. In the eyes of whatever law existed in this forsaken place, she was now his responsibility. Moments later, the enclosure released with a dry hiss. Cold air billowed outward. Kel entered without hesitation, removed his coat, and carefully wrapped it around her slender form. Her body felt alarmingly light, malnourished, neglected, as he lifted her into his arms. She weighed less than he expected, as if her bones were hollow or composed of something lighter than carbon. Her eyelids fluttered, not quite opening, but something inside seemed to stir, like warmth attempting to return to an extinguished ember. A tremor passed through her body, not voluntary movement, but the involuntary response of neural pathways coming back online after prolonged dormancy. The handlers laughed as he departed. You'll regret that decision, outsider. The broken ones never recover. The smaller one called after him. When she finally dies, bring back the neural inhibitor. Those things are worth something at least. Kel offered no response, his back stiffening as he carried her through the exit, away from their callous amusement. Outside, the wind had intensified. Sleet sliced horizontally across his path, stinging his exposed skin. His breath formed dense clouds before him. He adjusted his grip, holding her closer against his chest. She showed no resistance, no acknowledgement, but her fingers curled faintly against his garment. A distant boom echoed across the valley. The settlement's atmospheric shield generators compensating for pressure changes as Taros 9 continued its irregular orbit. His dwelling stood at the ridge beyond the graveyard of collapsed communication towers and half-buried supply tunnels, a solitary structure anchored to the cliff face, powered by an ancient thermal tap. Kel traversed the familiar path without pause, his boots finding practiced grooves in the stone. The storm howled as if attempting to tear the moon into fragments. Emergency beacons flashed crimson warnings from the settlement below. Another system failure, another day of survival mode for the remaining inhabitants. Inside his shelter, warmth greeted them like a whispered reconciliation. The environmental system functioned adequately, barely. He carried her to the thermal platform and placed her down with careful precision. Then he knelt beside her, hands already moving, removing the tattered remnants of her garments, wrapping her in thermal blankets, checking her vital signs. His medical scanner, an outdated model salvaged from a crashed research vessel, beeped softly as it analyzed her physiology. Her skin temperature registered dangerously low, pulse faint but consistent. Unusual readings flashed across the scanner's display, cellular structures unlike anything in its database, resonance patterns that fluctuated with each shallow breath. He didn't know her designation, didn't understand why he'd intervened. He only knew that when he saw her abandoned after all others had been claimed, bartered, branded, something within him refused to walk away. He prepared a simple nutrient solution, basic protein synthesis with electrolytes, heated until steam appeared. The preparation unit hummed as it processed the molecular components, reconstructing them into something her system might recognize. He brought the container to her lips. She remained unresponsive, so he pressed the rim against her mouth. A single droplet touched her lips. She flinched. A flicker of something resembling confusion passed across her features. Then she parted her lips. She drank in trembling, halting sips. Too rapidly at first. She choked. He steadied her, waited, allowed her to try again. When she finished, her eyes remained closed, but her body relaxed fractionally. A muscle in her jaw unclenched. The pattern of bioluminescent markings beneath her skin pulsed once, then settled into a steady, dim glow. A solitary tear traced a path down her cheek and crystallized there. Kel withdrew, observing the steam rising from the empty container. He didn't speak again, but in that quiet space, with the storm scratching at the barriers like a forgotten deity, something had shifted. She wasn't gone, and he was no longer alone. The dwelling filled with the scent of heated stone and thawing fabric, like the moment after a blizzard when breath becomes visible again, not from fear, but from deliverance. From somewhere deep in the cliff, the thermal tap gurgled as it drew heat from the moon's core, channeling ancient energy into their small sanctuary. Kel secured the entrance against the storm's ferocity and stood motionless for a moment, listening to the space adjust around him. His boots released melted sleet onto the floor, creating small pools that steamed faintly in the gentle warmth radiating from the heating element. The woman lay where he had placed her, wrapped in thermal layers, framed by the amber glow of the low-intensity illumination, still as an ancient artifact. Her violet hair cascaded over the edge of the platform, ends dampening as frost melted away. She hadn't moved, hadn't vocalized, but something had changed. He couldn't identify what, only that the silence no longer felt hollow. The air between them seemed to carry intention now, as if molecules themselves arranged differently in her presence. Kel noticed the container she had sipped from, now clean, positioned carefully on the dwelling's shelf, not by his hand. Her fingers had moved, quietly, without request. That alone communicated more than countless exchanges might have. He studied the precise placement, centered exactly, handle aligned with the shelf's edge, a deliberate act requiring consciousness and care. He approached the heating core, adjusted the output by a single increment. A gentle mechanical whir initiated as warm air circulated through floor vents like a contented sigh. The subtle sound of thermal expansion, metal shifting against its structural memory, echoed in the background. Outside, the thermal sensors registered a further temperature drop as night fully claimed the moon. Inside, the difference between survival and extinction was measured in degrees. Outside, the wind had softened, though sleet continued to tap against the external walls like impatient fingers seeking entrance. She didn't turn toward the sound, didn't track his movements, but her breathing pattern had altered. Deeper, steadier, less desperate survival, and more genuine rest. The neural inhibitor collar had stopped its intermittent pulsing, its indicators dark. Whatever it had been suppressing in her was slowly awakening. He observed her for another moment, then crossed to the water reclamation unit in the preparation alcove. The generator surged as he heated water again, slightly warmer this time. He transferred it to a basin and returned to her side, cloth in hand. The water steamed in the basin, carrying the faint mineral scent unique to Taros 9's underground aquifers. She didn't resist as he gently touched her forehead with the dampened fabric. She didn't flinch, but her fingers twitched beneath the blanket, responding to the sudden contrast of warmth against her chilled skin. The markings beneath her skin brightened momentarily, following the path of his touch like living circuitry. "Just removing the residual frost," he murmured. "No harm intended." Still no verbal response, but her respiration changed, a slightly deeper inhalation, as if testing his scent, determining if he represented threat or safety. He continued with care, wiping her cheeks, the fine edges of her jawline, the delicate curve behind her ear. Her skin remained cool but no longer dangerously so. No indications of tissue damage, merely bruises that hadn't yet faded. along her collarbone, beneath one wrist. Not recent injuries, not healed ones. Beneath the bruises, intricate patterns moved, as if her biology was actively working to repair the damage at a cellular level. When he reached for her hand, she tensed. He paused, not retreating, not advancing, simply waiting. Not fear, not withdrawal, merely uncertainty, as if her physical form had learned to anticipate suffering from even the gentlest contact. He recognized that response, the body remembering what the conscious mind tried to forget. He set the cloth aside and simply held her hand between his, allowing her to experience the difference. No pressure, no demand, only connection, human and steady. He noticed how perfectly her fingers aligned with the spaces between his own, as if their hands had been designed as corresponding pieces. Minutes passed. The dwelling's environmental system cycled, a low hum followed by silence. A distant rumble from the colony below, perhaps a supply shuttle departing, perhaps another infrastructure failure. Neither of them acknowledged it. Then, with the barest whisper of movement, her fingers relaxed. Her palm rested lightly in his, still cool but no longer resistant. The tension in her wrist dissolved, replaced by a tentative acceptance. Kel exhaled, the breath leaving him in a slow, uneven sigh. He hadn't realized he'd been holding it. Something expanded in his chest. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps its distant ancestor. "I won't harm you," he said. "I don't know if you comprehend my language, but perhaps you can sense my intent." The translator implant behind his ear warmed slightly as it processed his words, searching for universal patterns she might recognize. She offered no reply, but he thought perhaps her head tilted half a degree toward his voice. The faintest crease appeared between her brows, like someone straining to hear a distant sound. He released her hand gently and stood, stretching until his spine realigned with an audible adjustment. Outside, wind slapped against the shelter once more, reminding him the power collectors would accumulate ice if he didn't clear them soon. He couldn't risk a system failure. Not now, not with her survival balancing on the edge of his technology's limitations. "Need to inspect the energy array," he said aloud, "primarily for her benefit. Requires approximately 15 minutes. You're secure here. Access point locks automatically. Environmental system stable." He wasn't certain she understood, but speaking the words aloud reinforced his commitment to return. To her, to this moment, to whatever was beginning between them. No answer, not even a glance. Still, when he moved toward the entrance, her fingers shifted again. A fractional movement, a slight tension at the edge of the blanket. She wasn't unconscious, but aware. That mattered. He prepared for exterior conditions, insulated outerwear, face protection, thermal gloves, and stepped into the pallid light of early evening. Taros 9's atmosphere appeared the color of brushed titanium, low and turbulent, illuminated faintly by the glow of a distant gas giant that hung like a tarnished beacon beyond the cloud cover. Celestia Prime, they called it, the failed terraform project that had been intended as humanity's new beginning, now just another abandoned corporate venture. The precipitation wasn't falling now, it simply hovered, suspended in bitter currents that whispered between the cliff formations. The cliffs themselves were streaked with metallic ore, remnants of the moon's volcanic past, now frozen in perpetual stillness. The energy collectors were half submerged again. He cleared them efficiently, practiced motions embedded in muscle memory from months of repetition. The system hissed and trembled as the accumulation detached. He adjusted the intake filter, verified the charge level, then paused, hands still resting on the framework, allowing the wind to press against him. The distant lights of the settlement flickered below, an increasingly rare sight as sections were systematically powered down to conserve resources. Why had he brought her here? He wasn't virtuous, not anymore. Not since the catastrophe, not since the conflagration. Everyone at the central colony had labeled it a tragic accident, a senseless mechanical failure. But the element he never disclosed, the component that still disrupted his sleep, was that he had been present when it occurred. And he had fled. He hadn't saved anyone. Until now. Perhaps. Maybe this represented a second opportunity. Or maybe it was merely desperation. The need to believe redemption remained possible even here, at the edge of inhabited space. Either way, she was here now, and something about her silence had awakened his voice. He dismissed the thought and returned along the path, boots compressing the precipitation with satisfying resistance. A distant howl echoed through the canyons, one of the indigenous predators that had adapted to Taros Nine's harsh environment, hunting whatever managed to survive in the valleys below. The dwelling remained warm upon his return. The illumination continued its steady glow. The aroma of heated fabric, mechanical lubricant, stone, and citrus-infused stimulant lingered in the atmosphere. She hadn't moved, but the blanket had shifted slightly, as if she'd drawn it tighter. Not from fear, but for comfort. And the container on the shelf, still clean, still positioned there, but her hands now rested palm upward atop the blanket. Inviting. He removed his outerwear, shook off the accumulated precipitation, and crouched beside her again. Droplets of melted ice glistened in his hair, catching the light like miniature stars. "I've returned," he said softly, voice calm. No verbal response. Then so faint he questioned whether he'd imagined it, she exhaled. Not merely breath, but release. Tension uncoiling. The luminescent patterns beneath her skin brightened momentarily, following her circulatory pathways like bioluminescent rivers. He remained there in the stillness, allowing her to adjust, permitting himself adjustment as well. The wall chronometer silently tracked the passing moments, each one stretching between them like a bridge under construction. And then, as he reached to modify the illumination intensity, she spoke. One word. "Why?" He froze. Her voice was barely audible, soft, foreign in its structure, shaped like breath catching on wind, but unmistakably clear. Deliberate. It contained harmonics his human ear couldn't fully process, but his nervous system responded to regardless. A vibration felt more than heard. He turned back toward her slowly. Her eyes were open, white and lavender both, clouded but not sightless. Distant but focused, not on him directly but on the space he occupied. Fractal patterns shifted across her irises, kaleidoscopic and mesmerizing. She didn't repeat the question. She didn't need to. He sat beside her on the floor and rested his elbows on his knees. The urge to look away from her gaze was strong. Not from fear, but from the sudden sense of being truly seen, perhaps for the first time since his arrival on this forsaken moon. "I observed you. Everyone else, they were claimed, purchased, taken." A pause. "You were abandoned, like refuse." The words felt inadequate even as he spoke them, failing to capture the strange compulsion that had drawn him to her. She said nothing. Her expression remained unchanged, but her fingers shifted again, a subtle motion that seemed to suggest she was processing his words, weighing them against some internal measure. He continued, "Perhaps I don't understand my own motivation. Perhaps I simply couldn't endure the silence." As he spoke, he realized the truth in his words. The silence of this place had been consuming him, one day at a time. That earned him the faintest crease between her brows, almost skepticism, or perhaps understanding. Her pupils contracted slightly, adjusting to the light, or perhaps to him. She blinked slowly, then her eyes closed again. This time she slept, not unconscious, not collapsed from deprivation or exposure. She chose rest. And Kel remained exactly where he was, watching her chest rise and fall until the heating element activated again with a soft exhalation, and the dwelling sighed with her. His hand rested near hers, not touching, but close enough to feel the subtle electromagnetic field that surrounded her, a gentle current that spoke of life processes entirely different from his own. The wind had dissipated overnight. This wasn't the typical storm-interrupted silence that hinted at worse to come. This quiet felt different, softer, expectant. Kel sat near the heating element, knees drawn to his chest, arms resting loosely across them. The warmth from the ancient system had finally penetrated the core of the dwelling. He could feel it in his hands again, in the small of his back, in his breath. The chronic chill that had settled in his bones during the long months of isolation seemed to retreat, if only temporarily. Across from him, the woman still slept. Not the strange, shallow breathing of a body conserving energy, but the deeper rhythm of genuine rest. Her chest rose and fell in synchronization with the subtle vibration of the dwelling's infrastructure. She hadn't cried out, hadn't startled during the night cycle. She had simply remained. The neural inhibitor collar had gone completely dark, its mechanisms apparently exhausted or overridden by whatever was awakening within her. He didn't disturb her. He sat and listened to the space around her, its tension gradually dissolving. He found himself tracking the subtle shifts in her breathing, the occasional movement of her fingers, the changing patterns of light beneath her skin, finding rhythm in these small signs of life. When she stirred, it wasn't sudden. Her fingers moved first, curling faintly around the edge of the blanket. Then her eyes opened, white and lavender, crystalline but alert. She scanned the room not with direct sight, but in layers, perceiving with her skin, testing the atmosphere. Her nostrils flared slightly, categorizing scents, identifying potential threats or safeguards. He waited, allowing her that first moment without pressure. The minutes stretched between them, comfortable in their silence. Eventually she sat upright. The blanket fell from her shoulders, pooling at her waist. The full pattern of bioluminescent markings was visible now, intricate whorls and spirals that traced her collarbones, shoulders and arms like living circuitry. "Good morning," he offered gently. Her gaze didn't settle directly on him, but somewhere near his voice. A slight tilt of her head suggested she was listening not just to his words, but to the spaces between them. "I believed I had died," she said. Her voice was stronger now, though still carrying those strange harmonics that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. "You didn't know," he replied. "You're here." The simplicity of the statement hung between them, neither promise nor platitude, just acknowledgement of the most basic truth. Existence. Continuation. A moment passed, then another. The heating element cycled, its gentle hum underlining the silence. Why inhabit a location like this? The question lingered, not accusatory but genuinely perplexed. She gestured vaguely at their surroundings, the solitary dwelling, the isolation, the deliberate distance from others. Kel stood and approached the modest preparation unit. He poured warm stimulant into 2 metal containers. The liquid steamed in the cool air, carrying the bitter scent of synthetic caffeine compounds. "I previously resided in a place with noise, color, population density," he said. "Then I lost people. After that, I lost my purpose. So I came here, somewhere no one would question what I used to be." The confession emerged more easily than he expected, as if her presence had loosened something long constricted within him. He offered her a container. She accepted it with both hands, holding it just below her face as if absorbing the vapor more than the liquid. Her fingers traced the container's edge with a delicate precision that suggested heightened tactile sensitivity. "Does it succeed?" she asked quietly. "Some days." The truth again, unvarnished. She sipped slowly, carefully. The silence between them softened. Something about her presence made the dwelling feel less like a shelter and more like a home, the difference subtle but profound. After several minutes, she stood. Kel tensed instinctively but remained motionless. He simply observed. She traversed the length of the dwelling without speaking. Her steps were soundless, deliberate. Her fingers traced the walls, the worn surface station, the carved seating platform. Each touch seemed to gather information, as if her fingertips could read the history of objects. At one point, she paused, pressing her palm flat against the wall nearest the thermal tap, eyes closing momentarily as if listening to something deep within the stone. She paused near the shelf where his older creative efforts rested, half-formed or long abandoned. She extended her hand and brushed the edge of one, a distorted polyhedron, abstract, shaped more by grief than by skill. As her fingers contacted the sculpture, the luminescence beneath her skin briefly intensified, responding to something within the material itself. Her brow creased. "This one resonates incorrectly." He smiled faintly. "That was my first attempt at creation after the catastrophe. I believe it's somewhat flawed." He recalled the trembling in his hands as he tried to shape the stone, how the chisel had slipped repeatedly, each mistake feeling like a confirmation of his failure. "No," she said, "not flawed, merely incomplete." Her fingers traced a line across the sculpture's surface, following what appeared to be a random pattern, but which he suddenly recognized as the natural grain of the stone, a path he'd ignored in his determination to impose his will on the material. She turned toward him, her hair glowing violet in the illumination from the heating element. Like you. He started to speak, then stopped. The observation struck too close to truth for immediate response. She continued exploring, this time near the storage access. There she discovered his emergency pack, a weatherproof container with essential implements, nutrient bars, medical coagulant, and 2 backup power cells. She ran her hand along the fastening mechanism and glanced towards him, her head tilted in silent question. "You were prepared to depart?" "No," he said. "I was prepared to persist." The distinction felt important, though he couldn't fully articulate why. She nodded, then did something unexpected. She knelt beside the container, opened it slowly, and removed 1 nutrient bar. She unwrapped it with careful, deliberate movements, broke it in half with precision, and extended a portion to him. The gesture carried ritual weight, as if sharing sustenance held significance beyond simple nutrition. He accepted it, noting how their fingers brushed in the exchange, a contact neither of them withdrew from. They sat cross-legged on the floor and consumed the sustenance in silence. The nutrient bar was bland, formulated for efficiency rather than pleasure, but somehow the shared experience transformed it. "The flavor quality is poor," she observed, "but it provides warmth and alleviates the emptiness." "I don't recall when I last shared sustenance with another," he admitted. The confession emerged unbidden, revealing more than he'd intended. "Nor do I," she paused, her voice softening. "My species, we don't consume in the presence of those we distrust. The mouth is sacred, vulnerable." As she spoke, the luminescent patterns beneath her skin pulsed gently, emphasizing her words. He considered this. And yet here we are. The implication hung between them. Trust, emerging from the most unlikely soil. She released a breath that resembled laughter, not complete or uninhibited, but authentic. The sound seemed to lighten the air between them. "You mentioned losing people. Who were they?" she asked. Her gaze had shifted, now more directly meeting his own, as if her vision were gradually adapting to his presence. He gazed into the heating element. The flames cast shifting patterns across his face, highlighting the lines that years of solitude had etched there. 3 apprentices, young, talented, superior to my abilities, likely. I was responsible for their instruction, but the workshop ignited. Electrical malfunction. I escaped. They didn't. Her eyes didn't waver. "You attempted intervention?" The question carried no judgment, only quiet inquiry. He nodded. The structural support collapsed. By the time I returned with assistance, the entire complex was destroyed. He didn't mention the nightmares, the way he still heard their voices calling for help, the guilt that followed him across star systems to this remote moon. "And you assume responsibility." "Every day." The words emerged as barely more than breath. They sat quietly again. Then she spoke, voice like vapor. "I once created a memory crystal for a maternal figure who had lost her bonded companion. She requested I capture his final communication within the formation. Was it effective?" He leaned forward slightly, genuinely curious. "I cannot say with certainty," she said. "She claimed success, but I couldn't perceive them myself, only the grief resonating through the crystal." Her fingers traced patterns in the air, as if recreating the crystal's structure. The resonance was pure, untainted by fear or regret, just love, preserved in molecular alignment. He met her gaze. "Can you still accomplish that?" "Occasionally, but I haven't attempted since the chemical suppression. I'm not the entity I once was." Her hand moved to the now dormant inhibitor collar, fingers tracing its circumference with careful precision. "No one remains unchanged after suffering," he said. "But perhaps that's what provides us form." He thought of his own transformations, how loss had carved him into someone unrecognizable to his former self. She tilted her head. "Precisely." A single word that suggested deeper understanding than pages of explanation might have conveyed. That night cycle, they didn't position themselves across the dwelling from one another. They worked side by side on a fresh medium, simple mineral clay. She pressed her hands into it first. Kel guided from behind, demonstrating how to create tension lines, how to shape without fracturing. The clay responded differently to her touch than to his, seeming almost to reach for her fingers, flowing with a fluidity he couldn't achieve alone. Their hands connected more than once. Neither withdrew. The points of contact between them began to feel natural, necessary components of the creative process they shared. By the cycle's conclusion, the clay held the first indication of something emerging. A curve, a gesture, a form neither could yet identify, but one that possessed substance. When they stepped back to observe their work, the luminescent patterns beneath her skin had aligned with the shape they'd created, as if her biology recognized and responded to the emerging form. When they reclined to rest, she didn't turn away. She faced him, not close enough for physical contact, but near enough to sense the distance diminishing between them. In the dim light, her eyes reflected like twin moons, watching him without fear or judgment. And for the first time, the dwelling didn't feel merely like refuge. It felt like commencement. The daybreak cycles manifested more gradually now, not because the cold had moderated, it remained just as merciless, but because neither rushed anymore. A rhythm had established between them, not through words but through movement, shared warmth, the way they transformed time into something tangible. The woman, Lyria, as she would later name herself, rose before Kel. She'd begun awakening early, stepping barefoot onto the heated floor sections and slipping into the workspace before the first stimulant heated. She never explained why. Perhaps she didn't understand herself. Perhaps it was merely the luxury of autonomous movement after confinement. Today followed the pattern. The pale blue light of Taros 9's thin atmosphere filtered through frost-decorated transparent panels as she crouched in the creation space, staring down at a segment of stone that refused communication. Her hands hovered above it, trembling faintly, as if attempting to interpret something inscribed deep within. The stone was veined with metallic deposits unique to this moon, traces of elements not found elsewhere in the system, elements that seemed to respond to her proximity with subtle electromagnetic pulses. She reached for a cutting implement. Her grip appeared unsteady. The implement trembled above the stone's surface, hesitating between intent and action. Kel's voice emerged from behind her, warm but hesitant. "Beginning something new?" "No," she said, attempting to complete something ancient. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, suggesting a connection to something that predated both of them. She didn't turn, just pressed the implement's edge against the stone's perimeter and paused. The tool trembled in her grasp. A drop of moisture fell from her face onto the stone. Not a tear, but condensation from her breath, freezing instantly on contact with the cold mineral surface. He crossed the space slowly, crouching nearby without intruding upon the zone between them. His presence felt like an offering, available but not imposed. "Would you welcome assistance?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I want to reconnect with what I once was." The luminescence beneath her skin had dimmed, as if her energies were focused inward, searching for something lost. Her hand moved. The implement struck too forcefully. The stone split, not elegantly, not with precision. A jagged fracture zigzagged across the surface, disrupting the potential form before it could manifest. The sound of breaking stone echoed in the small space, sharp and final. She froze. Every luminescent pattern beneath her skin darkened simultaneously, as if responding to shock. Kel waited. He recognized the moment, the paralysis that follows perceived failure, the instant when possibility collapses into disappointment. She remained motionless, didn't breathe. Then abruptly she stood and hurled the implement across the room. It collided with the far wall with a clatter that reverberated like a scream. The impact left a mark in the stone wall, not damage but impression, as if the dwelling itself recorded her frustration. "I cannot perform this function," she whispered. The harmonics in her voice intensified with the motion, creating strange resonances in the metallic objects nearby. Kel stood. The air between them felt charged, electric with her distress. "I cannot perform this function," she repeated, louder now. "I perceive nothing. I experience nothing. It's all vacant. Her hands clenched and unclenched, luminescent patterns flowing like agitated currents beneath her skin. She retreated from the damaged stone, shoulders heaving. Her breath came in uneven gasps, as if the act of breathing itself had become unfamiliar. Do you comprehend what they extracted from me? I wasn't merely trained to shape stone. I was the stone, the sanctuary perceived through me, and now exists only silence. She pressed her hands against her temples, as if trying to contain something threatening to burst free. He didn't attempt speech. Not yet. He recognized this moment too, the breach of a dam long held, emotions finally finding voice after prolonged suppression. I created for the deceased, she said, her voice fracturing, for the wounded, for those unable to bear their anguish, and now I cannot even form a basic line without destroying it. Her words carried the weight of not just personal loss, but cultural extinction, the severing of an ancient tradition. Her legs surrendered. She descended to the floor, arms wrapped tightly around herself. The luminescence beneath her skin pulsed erratically, like a heart struggling to maintain rhythm. Kel crossed the room and sat beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't touch her. He simply waited until her breathing slowed, until the trembling subsided, until her silence transformed from panic into weariness. The patterns beneath her skin gradually stabilized, finding their natural rhythm once more. Then he said gently, I didn't contact stone for 5 annual cycles. She looked at him. The fractal patterns in her eyes shifted, focusing more clearly on his face. I attempted once, he continued, the 7-day period following the fire. My hand slipped. I severed the creation's core completely. Afterward, I stored every implement, every forming tool, every fragment of clay. The memory was still vivid, the sound of the chisel striking wrong, the perfect crack that had split the sculpture in two, the way he'd swept the tools into a container and sealed them away, as if they were dangerous rather than merely innocent extensions of his own damaged intent. Wait, she asked. The question held genuine curiosity beneath the exhaustion. Because I believed creation should emerge from tranquility, and I possessed none. He glanced at his hands, the small scars from years of work, the calluses that had softened during his self-imposed creative exile. And now? Now I understand it doesn't. It emerges from anguish, from memory, from choosing to shape it regardless. He looked at the fractured stone. Not ruined, he realized, but transformed. The break had revealed interior structures, crystalline formations that would have remained hidden otherwise. She stared at the fractured stone before her. The illumination from the heating element caught the newly exposed surfaces, creating prismatic reflections across the workspace. I want to accept that premise, she said. Her voice had steadied, finding its center again. You needn't, just begin with attempting again. He gestured toward the stone, seeing not failure but possibility in its altered form. A prolonged silence persisted. The dwelling's environmental system cycled, a brief surge of warm air flowing across the floor. Outside, a distant rumble suggested changing weather patterns, perhaps the end of the current storm cycle. Then she shifted closer to him, leaned slightly, not against him but toward him, as if gravitational forces had altered. The subtle electromagnetic field that surrounded her brushed against his awareness, a gentle current that spoke of life-seeking connection. I experienced shame, she whispered. As did I. The admission came easily now, as if her presence made honesty more natural than concealment. I feel fragmented. I understand. And you remain here. He nodded, because broken elements don't remain in that condition indefinitely. Not if they're supported. The words emerged from some deeper wisdom he hadn't known he possessed. Her eyes shimmered, not from tears but from something deeper. Recognition. Resonance. The fractal patterns in her irises aligned momentarily with the luminescent markings beneath her skin, creating a brief moment of perfect symmetry. Slowly she turned toward him and rested her forehead gently against his shoulder. The contact sent a subtle vibration through him, as if some energetic exchange occurred where they touched. He allowed her. More than that, he welcomed the connection, realizing how long it had been since he'd experienced physical contact that wasn't transactional or hostile. They remained there until the heating element dimmed and the wind intensified again outside. The silence between them had transformed. No longer empty space, but filled with unspoken understanding. Later that evening cycle, she stood before the same stone segment she'd fractured. She hadn't discarded it. She'd positioned it upright again, carefully, like an injured limb reset within its structure. The fracture lines caught the light, creating new geometries, new possibilities. Kel observed from the work surface, consuming bitter stimulant. The hot liquid warmed his hands through the container, a simple pleasure he had once taken for granted. She selected a smaller implement, not the heavy one from before. This one conformed more naturally to her grip. She pressed its edge to the fracture line and began tracing it, not to eliminate, but to follow. Her movements were deliberate, each touch a conversation with the material rather than an imposition upon it. He rose and moved beside her. Shall we shape it together? The invitation carried no pressure, only possibility. She didn't answer with words. She simply shifted slightly leftward and created space for him beside her. The gesture contained acceptance more profound than verbal assent might have conveyed. They worked in silence, implements moving in synchronization, each echoing the other's motion. The fracture became a line. The line became a curve. The curve became something exquisite, not because it was flawless, but because it conveyed truth. As they worked, the luminescent patterns beneath her skin began to align with the emerging form, as if her biology recognized and celebrated the creation. Later, as they sat beside the heating element, Kel asked, "What designation were you assigned before your captivity?" The question had lingered in his mind since their first exchange. She shook her head. "We didn't possess designations as you understand them. We were echoes, reflections of those who preceded us." Her hands moved as she spoke, shaping invisible patterns in the air. "Our identities existed in relationship, not in isolation. I was known by my function, my resonance pattern, my place within the sanctuary's hierarchy. And now?" The question was gentle, offering rather than demanding. She turned toward him, eyes luminous in the flickering light. The fractal patterns in her irises had stabilized, displaying intricate geometries that seemed to mirror the patterns beneath her skin. "Now I am Lyria, because you inquired." The name emerged not as something retrieved from memory, but as something newly created between them, an identity formed in the moment of its utterance. His chest constricted at the quiet significance of that statement. The gift of naming herself, of claiming identity after having it stripped away, felt sacred. He extended his hand and touched hers gently, not to direct, not to claim, but to remain. The subtle current between them strengthened, a tangible connection that transcended simple physical contact. And this time she interlaced her fingers with his without hesitation. Where their skin touched, the luminescent patterns beneath hers brightened, flowing toward the points of contact as if drawn to his warmth. The moon felt unnaturally still. The precipitation had ceased. No wind whispered against the transparent panels. No sounds emanated from the mountain ledge that cradled their dwelling like a mineral within a giant's palm. Even the heating element seemed to hum more softly, as if the atmosphere itself had learned to hold its breath. Lyria noticed first. She sat cross-legged beside the completed creation, one hand pressed gently against its surface, eyes closed, not listening with her auditory organs, but with her entire physical form. The luminescent patterns beneath her skin had gone still, no longer flowing but alert, like sentinels. She turned toward Kel without speaking. The fractal patterns in her eyes had contracted to pinpoints, focused and intense. He froze, interpreting the tension in her shoulders, the strain beneath her breath. After these cycles together, he had learned to read her subtle signals, the language of her body that spoke more clearly than words. "Someone approaches," she whispered. The harmonics in her voice had shifted to a lower register, carrying warning. He didn't question how she knew. He trusted her now, just as she had begun to trust him. Her sensitivity to vibration, to energy fields, had proven itself repeatedly in their time together. He stood quickly, silently, retrieving his exterior garment from its position near the access point. The defensive implement, an outdated energy-charged projectile model, hung beside it. He hadn't touched it in weeks. He secured it across his shoulder, feeling its familiar weight settle against his back. "You will remain inside," he said, The protective instinct surprised him with its intensity. Lyria rose, gaze unwavering. The luminescent patterns beneath her skin had arranged themselves in what he now recognized as a defensive configuration, concentrated near her vital organs in major neural pathways. I won't conceal myself. You're not hiding, you're persisting. I didn't return to existence to be warehoused again. Her voice carried the steel of determination, reminding him that despite her vulnerability, she possessed a core of extraordinary resilience. He regarded her for an extended moment, then nodded once and handed her the resonance rod from his utility belt, a carved handle with a crystalline tip. She could amplify vibrations with it if necessary, not as a weapon, but as warning. The crystalline component hummed faintly as she took it, responding to her touch as if recognizing a kindred energy. If conditions deteriorate, he said, create mountain resonance. The instruction was unnecessary. She knew the rod's capabilities better than he did, but speaking it aloud helped steady his own resolve. She nodded, lips pressed into a line of frigid resolve. The luminescent patterns beneath her skin flowed into her hands, concentrating around her fingers where they gripped the resonance rod. He opened the exterior hatch. The atmosphere felt thinner than previously, brittle and sharp, as if carved from transparency. The distant mountains stood in stark relief against the pale sky, every ridge and shadow defined with unnatural clarity. Down the incline, 3 figures advanced, not rapidly, not stealthily, but with purpose. Their breath formed dense clouds in the frigid air, marking their steady progress up the slope. The first he recognized, the man from before, with damaged facial tissue and asymmetrical smile. This time he wasn't isolated. 2 others flanked him, one broad-shouldered and armored, the other with elongated implements secured to her back. Not military personnel, freelance extractors. Their equipment bore the mismatched insignia of various corporations, scavengers using cast-off technology to hunt valuable resources across the outer colonies. Kel stepped out, boots compressing the frozen surface. The projectile weapon remained secured across his back, present but not brandished. A statement rather than a threat. "You exercise poor judgment," the scarred man called out. "Should have surrendered her when opportunity existed." His voice carried clearly in the still air, amplified by the acoustic properties of the surrounding cliffs. "She isn't your property," Kel responded, voice amplified now. "She's a sentient being, under my protection." The words emerged with a certainty that surprised him, not rehearsed but deeply felt. The female extractor produced a sound of amusement. "You believe that carries significance in this region?" She gestured broadly at the desolate landscape around them. "Law exists where enforcement exists. I see neither here." "I believe it suffices. Withdraw." Kel's stance shifted subtly, center of gravity lowering, preparing. "Step aside," the large one growled. "We have a client waiting. Elite collector. Rare resonance sensitives command substantial value currently. You don't comprehend her nature." His hand rested on a weapon holstered at his side, a neural disruptor designed to incapacitate without permanent damage to valuable merchandise. "Unnecessary. She resonates. That's all they require." The scarred man's gaze shifted past Kel, focusing on the dwelling entrance with naked greed. Behind him, a low vibration disturbed the ground, subtle but intensifying. They all perceived it, the sensation traveling through their boots, up through their bodies. Even the air seemed to vibrate, molecules aligning with the emerging resonance pattern. Lyria stood in the access point, her hand gripping the rod, her expression a mask of controlled fury. Around her, the frozen precipitation shifted, not from wind, but from sound. The minerals beneath the dwelling moaned with ancient memory. The luminescent patterns beneath her skin had fully activated, glowing with intensity that made her appear incandescent against the dwelling's darker interior. "She's generating that?" the woman hissed, taking an involuntary step backward. Her hand moved to her sensory equipment, which was emitting warning signals in response to the unusual energy patterns. "Yes," Kel confirmed, "and you should depart before she decides to increase output." His voice remained calm, but his stance was uncompromising. But the man didn't retreat. He advanced, hand moving to his weapon. You genuinely believe I fear a damaged sanctuary remnant and a disgraced creator? The sneer in his voice couldn't quite mask the uncertainty in his eyes as the vibrations intensified. Kel's finger moved toward his weapon strap. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, potential energy gathering like a storm. Then Lyria stepped forward, barefoot on the frozen surface, skin emitting a faint glow in the low light. Her voice remained quiet, but every syllable landed like a gravitational anomaly, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the molecular structure of the ice beneath their feet. I am not damaged. Simple words that carried complex truth. She raised the rod and tapped it against the precipitation. The mountain responded, not with violence, not with collapse, but with warning. The ridge above them groaned, precipitation loosened, mineral formations trembled in position. The very air seemed to crystallize around them, molecules aligning with her intent. I once carved extinction songs, she said. I understand how to make a mountain grieve. The luminescent patterns beneath her skin flowed in complex configurations, extending beyond her physical form to interact with the environment itself. The wind returned, howling around the bluff as if suddenly remembering its voice. The sound carried strange harmonics, notes that shouldn't exist in natural air currents. The three strangers froze, heads jerking toward the sound above. Fear registered on their faces, not the calculated risk assessment of professional extractors, but primal recognition of forces beyond their comprehension. You don't wish to witness what manifests when I experience true loss. Her eyes had shifted color, the lavender deepening to violet, the fractal patterns spinning in complex configurations that seemed to reach out, touching their minds directly. The first man sneered, but his hand trembled visibly now, his confidence fractured. His weapon remained holstered, his threat unexecuted. Very well, he spat. Keep your acquisition. She represents more complication than value. The false bravado couldn't mask his retreat. He turned, boots grinding into the slope, and the others followed. They didn't flee, but they didn't look back. Their postures spoke of defeat disguised as tactical withdrawal. Lyria remained motionless until the final echo of their movements vanished. Only then did she lower the rod. The luminescence beneath her skin gradually dimmed, returning to its normal, gentle glow. Her legs buckled. Kel was beside her instantly, catching her before she contacted the frozen surface. Her skin felt ice cold, her breathing ragged. The energy expenditure had clearly depleted her, drawing on reserves not yet fully restored after her captivity. You were trembling, he whispered. As were they, she replied faintly, smiling. Despite her exhaustion, triumph glimmered in her eyes, not for defeating them, but for reclaiming part of herself they had tried to take. He carried her inside, not because she lacked strength, but because she had utilized every remaining ember of energy to become more than what they had attempted to reduce her to. Her body felt lighter than before, as if some part of her essence had been expended in the demonstration. He placed her near the heating element, wrapped in thick coverings. She didn't speak. Her eyes closed, but her fingers reached out, finding his. The familiar current passed between them, weaker now, but steady. She didn't release. Neither did he. The storm had dissipated again, but the cold persisted. It infiltrated through the structural panels and into the fissures of the stone flooring. Outside, the wind rested, but the precipitation conversed in sighs as it shifted against the dwelling's seams. The mountains stood silent against the pale sky, ancient and indifferent to the small dramas that played out upon their slopes. Inside, the warmth endured, barely. Kel agitated the energy source in the heating element, the metal rod clicking against stone. The thermal output was diminished compared to standard, rationed fuel since the last power surge had disabled the solar heating cycle. The dwelling's reserves were not infinite, a fact he had become increasingly aware of as two now depended on its protection. He hadn't informed Lyria yet. He would when the illumination returned, when the timing didn't feel like surrender. Some truths were better shared in light than in shadow. She sat across from him, legs tucked beneath a dense insulating covering, her gaze fixed not on the heating element, but on the half-carved stone segment between them. The creation lacked definitive shape yet, only suggestion, a spiral of motion at its center, a gradual rise of contrast along one edge. It resembled breath arrested halfway, potential suspended in material form. She extended her hand and touched the perimeter. Her movement was steady but unhurried, listening, interpreting what hadn't been inscribed. The luminescent patterns beneath her skin flowed toward her fingertips, as if gathering information through direct contact. Her voice, when it emerged, was quiet, factual. You haven't created since they appeared. He didn't respond immediately, not from reluctance, but because he wasn't certain how to articulate it. The words formed slowly, thoughtfully. They came for what I safeguard, he said. That transforms how my hands perceive. His gaze fell to his own hands, noting how they had tensed at the memory of the confrontation. She nodded once, fingertips still contacting stone. I comprehend. Her understanding seemed to extend beyond his words to the emotion beneath them, how threat had reawakened old patterns of vigilance, redirecting creative energy into protective instinct. Silence expanded between them, not the brittle kind, but the dense one, the kind saturated with unspoken elements. The heating element crackled softly, a fragment of fuel collapsing into ember. I experienced fear, she said. Her face was angled slightly toward the heating element now, eyes capturing fragments of illumination. The confession emerged not as weakness, but as shared truth. He looked up. The light caught the planes of her face, highlighting the delicate structure beneath her cerulean skin. Not of them, she continued, of what I might become, of utilizing that resonance again. You halted them, but I employed what I was conditioned for as a weapon. A sanctuary listener should never convert resonance into harm. Her fingers traced patterns in the air, not random movements, but specific forms, cultural sigils that spoke of ancient prohibitions and sacred boundaries. You didn't cause injury, he said. You warned. He saw the distinction clearly, even if it blurred in her perception. Her eyes shifted to his. For once, they maintained contact. The fractal patterns within them had stabilized, no longer shifting but steady, focused. I still experience it, she whispered. The power, like heat I cannot release. Her hand closed into a loose fist, the luminescence pulsing beneath her skin in time with her heartbeat. He reached across the floor and positioned his hand beside hers, not touching, but proximate, an invitation without demand. Thermal energy isn't malevolent, he said. It only consumes when uncontained, but it also provides warmth, illumination, form. He glanced at the heating element, the core of their survival in this hostile environment. Dangerous if unleashed, essential when respected. She regarded him. The space felt more confined, not in dimension but in distance. The air between them seemed charged, molecules aligning as if responding to some subtle electromagnetic field generated by their proximity. Outside, the precipitation pressed against the structural panels. Inside, the heating element fractured softly. The light flickered over them, tracing lines of exhaustion and tension that hadn't yet dissolved, but were gradually transforming into something else, something like peace, or its beginning. Lyria moved her hand slightly. Her fingers brushed his, not accidental, not urgent, just present. The contact sent a now familiar current between them, a tangible connection that transcended simple physical touch. His breathing slowed, finding rhythm with hers. She turned her palm to meet his. Their hands aligned, dermal layer against dermal layer, not interlaced, not clasped, just parallel, like two segments of a whole that finally comprehended where it belonged. The luminescent patterns beneath her skin flowed toward the points of contact, creating intricate designs where they touched. I haven't rested, she said. The admission carried no complaint, merely observation. You haven't achieved relaxation. He understood, the vigilance that persisted even in safety, the body remembering threat long after the mind recognized security. She released a breath of agreement, then looked down at their hands. The contrast between his human skin and her cerulean tone created its own beauty, different natures finding harmony. I don't understand how to initiate sleep when I'm not afraid. The paradox of peace after prolonged danger, how safety itself becomes unfamiliar, almost threatening in its strangeness. You could attempt beside me. The invitation emerged without calculation, simple in its offering. She didn't move for a moment. Then she stood silently and crossed to the resting platform. She sat first, waited. He followed, noting how the luminescent patterns beneath her skin shifted in anticipation. They reclined side by side, fully clothed, physical forms respectfully separated initially. Then the heating element diminished, and she shifted closer, just enough that her forehead contacted his shoulder. Her hand found his beneath the covering. Her leg, half bent, rested lightly against his thigh. Each point of contact generated its own current, creating a circuit between them. He remained still, silent. He simply stayed, his presence an anchor, not a constraint, and she exhaled, slow and uneven, a sigh she hadn't released in years. The sound contained volumes, relief, surrender, the letting go of a weight carried too long. Her voice disrupted the silence, fragile. "If I sleep now, will you remain when I awaken?" The question held all her history, abandonment, captivity, the tentative trust now forming between them. He turned his head, forehead against hers. Yes. Nothing more. No elaborate promises, no grandiose declarations, just the simple commitment to presence, to continuation. He closed his eyes, and so did she. Not because she trusted the universe, but because for once she trusted him. And perhaps, in some small measure, herself. And in that dwelling, buried in precipitation and silence, two scarred entities finally rested. Not in separate corners, not as visitor and host, but as something unnamed and becoming. Something neither had anticipated, but both now recognized as essential. The heating element smoldered low and warm, and for the first time Lyria dreamed without restraints. The luminescent patterns beneath her skin flowed in gentle rhythms, no longer constrained by fear or inhibition, but expressing her true nature, resonant, receptive, alive. Outside, Taros 9 continued its slow rotation, indifferent to the small miracle occurring within the solitary dwelling. But inside, two broken beings had begun to heal each other, finding in shared damage the possibility of wholeness neither could achieve alone. The universe might have forgotten this remote moon, this lonely outpost at civilization's edge, but within these walls, something had been remembered, the fundamental truth that connection transcends isolation, that warmth defeats cold, that even in the harshest environments, life finds ways to flourish. And as they slept, the fractured stone sat on the work surface, its broken edges catching the heating element's light, no longer ruined but transformed, ready to become something neither of them could have created alone.